Welcome to another edition of This Week in Mishnah Yomi. Today's Mishnah I'd like to spend a little more time on and delve into a little bit is the Mishnah at the end of Perek Vav, chapter 6 of Mishnah Peah, where it talks about how certain, if there were some leftover after the harvest, sometimes if you leave over, it doesn't count as shikha because of the reason why it was left over. You didn't mean to leave it over, and therefore it's not shikha, but at other times it's not an excuse. So the Mishnah at the end of the 6th chapter of Peah tells us, Hakocha Balayla, if you harvest at night, V'ma'amer, someone gathers bundles at night, so and then you leave the shikha there, so that counts as shikha. In other words, just because you did it at night and you left over more than you might have otherwise, that is the risk you run by harvesting at night. Similarly, basuma, yesh lahem shikha. In other words, if a blind person is harvesting the field and leaves over amounts that would qualify as shikha, so it's shikha. The excuse can't be, oh, I'm blind. I left over. I didn't mean I'm leaving it over. No, that's the risk you take by harvesting when you are blind. If a person's blind, and therefore anything that he leaves over, the blind man leaves over, would be considered shikha. And the Rabbi Bartanura, so the topic at hand I'd like to spend a little time on is the degree to which suma, blind person, is obligated in mitzvos. Again, it's not entirely clear from this Mishnah whether the kotzer, the person who's doing the harvest, is in fact the owner of the field. It could just be that this blind person is an employee, is a sharecropper or some other type of employee that is employed by the farmer. But even if the blind person owns the field, if he's blind and he's harvesting his own field, it's not an excuse, and what he leaves behind is shikha. So it opens up the possibility of considering the possibility: is a blind person, if the blind person owns the field, is he indeed, in fact, chayav and shikha? So that opens the larger conversation. What is the relationship between blind people and mitzvos? And the reason why this is discussed, one might think, well, why shouldn't blind people be obligated in mitzvos? And the discussion begins with the Gemara in Kedushin, Avlam and Aleph, which cites a machlokas on this very issue, whether a suma is chayav in mitzvos. Rabbi Yehuda says that blind people are exempt from all mitzvos. And in fact, there's a back and forth. Rav Yosef, who was blind himself, originally had hoped that the halacha was like Rav Yehuda, because then when he would fulfill mitzvos, he would be an eno mitzvah v'yoseh. He would fulfill mitzvos not due to an obligation that he has from the Torah, but rather out of the goodness of his heart, right? An eno mitzvah v'yoseh, a person who's not obligated and does so anyway. He was under the impression that an eno mitzvah v'yoseh is greater. If you're not obligated to do something and you do so, it is more praiseworthy than a mitzvah v'yoseh. Ultimately, however, we say, and Rav Yosef came to the same conclusion: Gadol mitzvah v'yoseh misha eno mitzvah v'yoseh. That's better that a person is given greater credit, greater reward, greater accolades for fulfilling mitzvahs that he has an obligation or she has an obligation towards, instead of doing mitzvos out of the goodness of one's heart without any obligation. And this can be explained in a number of different ways. One famous way of understanding this is as a result of the fact that mitzvos, when a person is obligated in mitzvos, she or he has a contrarian streak, has a yetzer hara, an evil inclination to defy, to disobey, to rebel against that which we are obligated to do. And that rebellious streak does not find expression, does not have a need to express itself when it's eno mitzvah v'yoseh. And therefore, the more obstacles we overcome are found when we are mitzvah v'yoseh. Therefore, Rav Yosef ultimately was hoping that he would be a mitzvah v'yoseh, that he would be obligated in mitzvos, so that he would get the full reward of a mitzvah v'yoseh. Now, even so, he hoped that we don't pass him like Rav Yehuda. Now, to take a second, in Rav Yehuda, the Pri Megadim explains that even according to Rav Yehuda, who holds that a suma is not obligated in mitzvos, The blind would only be exempt, says the Pri Megadim, according to Rabbi Yehuda, in mitzvahs aseh, but they would still be obligated in all the mitzvahs lo aseh. But this is all pretty much lahalacha v'lo l'masa. This is all pretty much the discussion, the explanation, the understanding within the position of Rabbi Yehuda. It's pretty much academic, because the consensus of Rishonim hold like the Chachamim, who obligate a summa in all mitzvos, and the Mishnah Berurah and Siman Nun Gimel Siv Katan Mem Aleph quotes this as the normative halacha, that a summa is obligated in all mitzvos, and treated like everyone, like every other Jew. Just to spend a few minutes on some particular cases, can a summa is obligated, let's say in tefillah, it's obligated in prayer. Can a blind man serve as a shliach tzibor to help other people fulfill their mitzvah of tefillah b'tzibor? So the Gemara in Megillah Daf Dalet Amud Aleph says that, according to here too, quotes a dispute Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, where Rabbi Yehuda once again says that since a blind person never saw the me'orot, never saw the celestial beings, the sun, moon, and stars, so it's inappropriate, it's impossible for the blind person to recite that bracha on behalf of others, Yotzer HaMe'oros, like we say in Birchos Kriyas Shema. And Rabbi Yehuda says that is the basis for exempting a blind person from serving as a shliach tzibor across the board. However, here too the Chachamim say that is not the case. That a blind person can in fact serve as a shliach tzibor. He has not seen the celestial beings, sun, moon, and stars. Nonetheless, one can appreciate them and say, praise God for creating them, even if the blind person has never seen them himself. And we hold, like the Chachamim, that in fact a blind person can serve as a shliach tzibor, as a chazan. Now the Rosh says, quotes this la'alacha, that yes, a blind person can serve as a shliach tzibor. However, a blind person cannot serve in another communal functionary role, and that is a bal koreh. The blind person cannot read Torah on behalf of the community, on behalf of olim who get aliyahs, and this is true even if he knows the entire Torah by heart. He's not allowed to serve as the bal koreh. This goes back to the times of the Gaonim. Rav Netzronai Gaon is quoted as explaining why a blind person is not allowed to serve as a bal koreh, because the Torah, the obligation, the fulfillment of the mitzvah of reading the Torah is one of reading the Torah from inside a Torah scroll. It's not just learning Talmud Torah. You can do without a text. Torah Sheba'al Peh. You can learn Torah Sheba'al Peh, Ba'al Peh. You can learn it by heart. You can learn Mishnayos by heart. You can learn anything by heart. That's Torah Sheba'al Peh. And of course, a blind person is obligated in learning Torah, and if the blind person knows Torah, they should teach Torah, right? Nothing wrong with that. But in the ritual of reading Torah, that has to be read, of Torah Shebichtav, needs to be read from a written scroll, a written Torah scroll. And therefore, the Rosh, that's the basis for the Rosh, that a blind person cannot serve as bal koreh. How about a blind person getting an aliyah? A blind person may not be able to read the Torah, and that may lead us to believe they're not included in any way in the mitzvah of reading the Torah publicly in this fashion. And therefore, we might lead us to believe that a blind person cannot get an aliyah. And this is, in fact, the position of the Beis Yosef. Rav Yaakov Emden also holds this way, based on the Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Cairo. However, the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlitz, quotes the Maharil, that we are lenient to allow a blind person to get an aliyah. The Taz says similarly, and quotes a story brought down by the Lavush, where in an instance in which a blind man was given an aliyah in the presence of many great rabbis, none of whom complained about it. So it's like a Maaseh Rav, a story that supports the halachic position of the Ramah and the Maharil, that a blind person can get an aliyah. What the Mishnah Berurah in Simin Kuf Lamed Tes Yud Beis and Yud Gimel says that perhaps we can understand the reasoning of the Ramah in light of the current practice of Torah reading, where the person who gets the Aliyah is not reading the Torah himself. Rather, there's a Baal Koreh reading, and that Baal Koreh is reading on behalf of the Oleh, the person who gets the Aliyah, as well as the entirety of the congregation. We're supposed to be able to hear the Baal Koreh when he lanes, because it's for all of us. It's an exercise in communal, congregational Talmud Torah. And being that there's a Baal Koreh who can see and is reading from the Torah scroll text, the person who's getting the aliyos, we are less concerned whether he is able to read from the Torah. And therefore, even a blind person, just as a person who can see, who can't read without vowels, who can't read Hebrew, can't read from the Torah scroll, we would allow them to, in today's day and age, to get an aliyah. Similarly, because there's a Baal Koreh who's reading the Torah appropriately from an appropriate text, so too a similar situation applies to the blind person. He may not be able to see, but the Baal Koreh, who is fulfilling his obligation of reading the Torah in public for the Oleh and for the entire congregation, he is reading it appropriately. There's one or perhaps two exceptions to this, and that is when the person getting an aliyah is getting an aliyah that may have a Torah reading that is of a biblical obligation. This only happens once, maybe twice a year. In other words, generally speaking, the Torah reading is a takana of Ezra, but the Torah reading associated with Parshat Zachor, coming up in a couple, next week, 2 weeks, that has a status of a Torah, perhaps, or the way we treat it is a Torah level obligation. Therefore, the person getting the aliyah should be someone who is eligible on a Torah level to receive an aliyah. And that is why, for instance, that is why it is suggested that a blind person should not get the aliyah associated with the maftir Parshat Zachor, and according to some opinions, the maftir for Parshat Para, of the 4 special maftirs between now and Pesach, Shkalim, Zachor, Para, and HaChodesh, there are opinions, many opinions hold that Zachor is a Torah obligation, and some opinions hold that Parshat Para, hearing Parshat Para, is an obligation on a Torah level as well. And so therefore those 2 aliyos would be the only aliyos in our practice, as brought down by the Mishnah Berurah and the Ramah, that there may be some cause for pause and consideration whether a blind person can get that aliyah, but all the other aliyahs a blind person can get, because so long as there's a Baal Koreh who's reading the aliyah from the text itself, from the text of the Torah himself. One last point: what about can a blind person? Is there any restriction on a blind person being a dayan, a court judge? So the Gemara in Yevamos stuff, Kof Aleph and Aleph, says that a blind person, based on a pasuk, a blind person would be disqualified from serving as a member of the Sanhedrin, similar to the fact that a blind person is disqualified from serving in the Beis HaMikdash as a Kohen. So there are certain functionary roles that a blind person is disqualified from. However, according to the consensus opinion, a blind person could serve as a dayan in a typical Beis Din that is adjudicating civil matters. Right, a person comes to a panel of judges. If the blind person happens to be a judge and happens to be equipped and knowledgeable to serve as a dayan, then he is not excused. He's not disqualified just due to his vision deficit, his inability to see. And so when it comes to the Sanhedrin, maybe that's a little bit more formal. For whatever reason, on technical grounds, there is a problem with a blind person serving as a dayan on the Sanhedrin. But in a typical case of a Beis Din, on civil matters, etc., being blind would not be a problem. One last point: the Rav Mibar Tanura explains that the Mishnah talks about a person who's kotzer balayla, vasuma yesh lehem shicha. Both of them, person who harvests at night or gathers gathers his bundles at night, or a blind person. So the Rav Bartanur says when it comes, none of the in all these cases, whatever's left behind is shicha. You can't make the excuse, oh, it was dark, or oh, the person harvesting was blind. The Rav Bartanur just makes the point that when it comes to suma, it doesn't make a difference whether the blind person was harvesting at night or harvesting during the day, as opposed to the other two clauses in the Mishnah, which are specifically about sighted people who harvest or bundle at night, and therefore may want to use that as an excuse for what they left behind. We don't accept that excuse, and what's left behind is shicha. So Rabbi Bartanur says it doesn't make a difference if by the summa whether the summa was harvesting or bundling at night or during the day. However, I just wanted to finish with this point. There are instances, especially in Hashkafa, where we talk about the difference between an iver bayom and an iver ba'afela. A blind person, what's the difference for a blind person at night or a blind person during the day? Either way, the blind person is blind. He or she can't see anything. So does it really make a difference if a blind person is functioning at night or during the day? So as it relates to Shicha in this Mishnah in Peah at the end of the 6th chapter, the Rav Bartanur is correct. There's no difference. A blind person is just as blind at night as and during the day as he is at night. However, I believe this is an idea found in Mesilat Yesharim, perhaps, and some of the other Svarim, that in other instances, also based on the pasuk and the curses in the Torah, an iver ba'afela is worse than an iver bayom, because an iver ba'afela, a blind person at night, right, is handicapped not only by his or her own disability, but by the fact that there's no one around that can help them, unless those other people have some assistive device like a flashlight or a torch or something that can help them see. But the blind person is also invisible to people who can help, and people who can help are limited by their inability to see at night, as opposed to an iver bayom, a blind person during the day. Although he or she is equally blind during the day as at night, nonetheless, they are in a position to be helped by those around them. And so therefore, there is a difference, right? When we think about the challenges of the world, we should try our best. We can't remove all the challenges, but we should recognize the difference between an iver ba'afela and iver bayom, and we should do our best to, whenever possible, to try to help out, right? Try to at least make the situation like an iver bayom, where there is the possibility of helping, where there's a possibility of intervening, of interceding to make things a little bit better, and not chas v'shalom a situation of iver ba'afela, where not only the iver, the blind person, him or herself, is unable to help, but there's no one else, God forbid, around to assist either. Hope you enjoyed. Tune in again next week. Wednesday, it will be uploaded for another